We did speak about this explanation of the pasuk Kisiste, that the whole notion of a Jew sinning is only associated with shtus, with the spirit of folly, a spirit of foolishness, because it doesn't make sense that a person should sin, because the notion of sin is the lowest expression or the greatest distance in, how do you say, proximity. We're not talking about the physical proximity, we're talking about the greatest distance that can exist of a entity, a created entity with its creator, is the notion of sin. Because even the spirit, and again very briefly, the spirit of impurity which persuades the person to sin is ultimately doing its mandate, as opposed to the person who sins. Again, we elaborated in this in length, previous and expanded on this in length in the previous classes. Opposed to the person sins, he's doing contrary. It's complete heresy. As we explained the similarity, or the reason why we use the term heresy, because it's complete denial in Hashem Echad, in the oneness of Hashem. No recognition, not only is it says, not even like the spirits of impurity which call God Elokad Elokaya, God of gods, because they recognize to some degree, subtly, the reality of God, as opposed to this person who sins, he is in complete denial of the oneness of Hashem, complete, not recognizing the Hashem's creator, and therefore, in essence, all sins are about Avodah Zarah, all sins are about idolatry, complete denial of the oneness of Hashem, and therefore, the pasuk testified that the whole notion of sin, the Gemara explains this pasuk, that the whole notion of sin is a shtus, it doesn't make sense, there's no basis logically, and it's all about a spirit of foolishness which it captures a person into its net, and the person would go ahead and sin. And interestingly, that this pasuk of sin associated with shtus, the pasuk says it about the woman who has a light. She's light in her action. I mean, she says she doesn't want to ground herself in the way it's demanded. Torah demands from the Jewish woman to live a modest life and to conduct herself based on the rules of tznius, of modesty, and she went astray. Again, as we mentioned this last week, that this pasuk deals with this famous saita, but she's accused of immodesty, and if there's accusation, there's a possibility, as they say, where there's smoke, there's fire, and there's a possibility, and maybe even a probability that she actually went astray. Yet, Torah says you don't have the witness. She goes through the process, and if she comes out clean, and she doesn't endure the consequences of the Seita based on what the Gemara says, or rather what the Pasuk says, and the Gemara explains in detail what happens to her, and she's proven innocent, so then she can go back and live with her husband. But interestingly, and based on this explanation of the Alter Rebbe over here, that the pasuk speaks about shtus, not by any other sin, but about the woman, because you're dealing with a certain taiva, a certain temptation, which generally this is one of the greatest struggle of man, of the human being, to maintain an entire life of purity, of modesty, of morality, an ethical life, a moral life, and therefore the pasuk deals with this shtus when it comes to the temptation of the woman to deviate, to go astray of the path of modesty, and she wants to give in to her taivas, into her lust, into temptations. Yet the pasuk says on her that it's also shtus. It doesn't make sense that even the same woman, if she, the day before, no, the day after for that matter, that very day, she would be placed on the test of idolatry. In other words, if she would been told that you must prostrate yourself, in other words, prostrate yourself to this idol, in other words, totally renounce the oneness of the Almighty, the oneness of Hashem, the oneness of God, she would allow herself to expire. She would say no, and they would say, we're going to kill you. She would allow herself to get killed, not to commit the sin of idolatry, as Alter Rebbe pointed out in the 19th chapter, or the end of the 18th chapter, then over our history. And it's factual, it's not a guess, it's not a theory, that in our history, sometimes precisely, the women, the simple, and again, it's not deriding the woman. In other words, the woman doesn't have usually the adequate time to invest herself in the scholarship of Torah, the scholarship of Hitbonuniyot, contemplation or pondering in the greatness, profoundly pondering in the greatness of Hashem. A woman has her mandate to be the Akeres Habayis, and therefore the men were usually more learned, and especially in these deep concepts of these oneness, of the Achdus Hashem, the oneness of Hashem. Yet we find that over our bitter history, it was the women, the children, the ignoramus. They gave up their life, and they went through fire and water, not to even verbally utter words which would demonstrate a renouncement of the oneness of Hashem. So the same woman, again, you're talking about the hundreds of thousands of our bitter history. So it's not theoretically maybe the woman would give up her life. The same woman would probably give up her life. Not to deny the oneness of Hashem, not to renounce the oneness of Hashem. And yet, she feels loose to go ahead and give in to this immodest temptation, which categorically and by definition, based on all this explanation, is exactly the same renouncing the oneness of Hashem, based on all this which we explained. So why would she do so? Why doesn't she stop short? Answer: it's a shtus. It doesn't make sense. There's no rational basis for it. There's no rational basis for it. It doesn't begin to make sense. And Alter Rebbe adds, and this is what we're going to see it today as well, that her holding herself back from this temptation, and no one's going to say it's simple or easy. It's not just like moving a person, not a computer, and you just say, okay, just change the program, and something totally new comes on the screen. A person is all about emotions and feelings and so on. When a person has sometimes a taiva, a certain temptation, to hold that back, not to give in to that temptation, sometimes many times, it's a war, it's a struggle, and to do so, it's a complete subordinance and self-negation, self-subjugation to the bigger picture, to the godly reality. And it's not easy. It's a milchama. The Rebbe even uses, I think, twice in Milchama Atzuma. It could be a very intense war, not to give in to a temptation, especially associated with areas of modesty. But yet, it still does not come close to the pain and the extraordinary detrimental pain of death. Nothing come close. In other words, as much as it's kind of a great struggle to want to hold himself back from a temptation, but it doesn't come to, and it's painful, but it doesn't come close to the pain of death. And yet, the pain of death she would accept upon herself, and the temptation to hold herself back to the temptation, she's not ready yet. And she can, again, we're not sure.
That depth of her neshama that she doesn't realize.
So they're not putting it together. They're not putting it together. That is a shtus. That doesn't make sense. It's, for instance, someone says, okay, this looks like poison, I won't eat it. But take poison, put it in a good porridge, submerge it in a good applesauce. I'm ready to go for it. I'm ready to eat it. I don't see the poison. Some healthy person is going to walk into the room and say, what are you talking about? It's exactly the same thing. If it's camouflaged with a certain external facade, doesn't change, takes away that this is a killer and that's a killer. The same thing. It's the same idea, based on all this explanation of the Alter Rebbe, the build-up and the way he culminates so beautifully in the explaining of this chapter 24. It's complete heresy. It's complete denial and renouncement of the oneness of Hashem. Yet she's ready to go off and do it. And it doesn't mean she, her, precisely the woman, in this case of Saita. The Torah deals with it because this becomes, on the overall, a struggle which is so crucial. There's nothing Hashem, it says, it's crucial on the positive side. Hashem appreciates modesty. And I want to say more than any other, obedience and our adherence to the Ratzon Hashem, because everything is important, Shabbos and Tefillin and Lul V'Nesri, but there's something very special on the positive side and also the negative side. This is the greatest struggles which we have, to keep a 24-hour clean mind, clean speech, clean action. We should, we can, we have the ability to, we have the mandate to, therefore we should and we can. And we have the ability to be completely control every speech, every thought, even modest thought, which we know is prohibited to think. As the Torah says, just like you're not allowed to speak and do contrary to the Ratzon, to God's desire, God set up rules of thought as well. Anything which entertains us, immodest entertainment, is prohibited to think and to invest our thoughts. our vision, our what we hear, but yet in the same token, we all agree that this is the great struggle. Therefore, which we have precisely in this area of modesty, but yet. So the Torah says kisista precisely when it speaks about the Saita, but it's our life, how modest we will be, and how in our, again, not only in our actions and our speech, but even in our thoughts. And there's the great struggle, and that becomes a bit like similar and tantamount to the struggle of which one would say, in other words, the closest to the greatest challenges we have is precisely in this area. So that's why the pasuk uses kisista to say it's difficult, it's very difficult, but it doesn't come close to the difficulty of expiring, of dying. And yet for death, I'm ready to go for something which is clear, overtly renouncing the oneness of Hashem, I'm ready to die for it. And here, to give up that taiva, I'm not ready for that. You're doing exactly the same thing. So how could you do it? And again, the holding oneself back is less than the pain of death, and there I'm ready to let loose. In the end of the day, that's heresy. And if I am, it's only a shtus, it's something which doesn't begin to make sense. And therefore, as human beings, we have to govern ourselves not to do silly things. Just like I won't someone, if I'm a shaita, in other words, if I'm a fool, I'm going to differentiate between the poison, or when the poison is just mixed with an applesauce. But a normal, healthy person says, no, I cannot live a foolish life and expire, let myself completely die because I decided that when it's in the applesauce, it's okay. No, I got to be healthy, and I have to realize and I have to stay focused. Understand, this is a killer and that's a killer. The same thing spiritually. The Torah says, don't be a fool. Don't be a shaita. And if this is a killer, that's a killer. This is heresy, and I'm ready to die for that. Not to chas v'shalom, prostrate myself to this idol. So too, this is complete heresy. And if it's heresy, I'm not going to do that, even if it takes effort. Especially, I know that the effort of holding oneself back is less than the effort of dying. And today we're going to read it a bit inside over here, or rather, pick up where we were holding. We explained it orally. Even a woman which is a type of woman which deviates from the structure of modesty. Shedaito kala, she has a loose mind, and because she has a loose mind, her mind is not firm, therefore she's ready to do things which are a loose type of action, in other words, to let loose. We ought to stay composed. One of the things about tznius is that initially we stay composed in our actions, in the way we conduct ourselves. It's about composure. I'm a composed person, therefore I control my actions, I control my speech. I even have the ability to control my thoughts. So when a person lets loose, that's when he's vulnerable to sin. And that's the word daitokalo. She makes a decision that she's going to deviate and she's going to let loose, and she's going to loosen up the firmness of the mind, which keeps composure, which usually, despite our challenges in this world, in this area of modesty, we have the ability to maintain complete, to be aligned with the way Hashem wants the human being to conduct themselves. But she lets loose, daitokala. She is a woman, again, this is the Saita, which she is daitokala, she has looseness of mind, and therefore she's ready to make herself vulnerable, or at least she's accused of making herself vulnerable to others. She would also govern in this spirit of this temptation. If she was a mensch and she would think right, and she would realize that just like bowing down to an idol is a killer, this is also a killer. It means that this is complete heresy as well. If she would focus and put things in perspective, she would also govern her spirit of her temptation. Lulei, and the only reason why she doesn't is because the spirit of foolishness, hamachasa, which covers up mastir and conceals and umayli misa'ava, and it hides rather and conceals the ava mesuteres, her inner innate love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, shebenafsho likis, which exists inevitably exist in her godly soul, ledafka b'emunas Hashem, to cleave in her faith of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'yichudi v'achdusei, in that oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the unity of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, v'leili farid chas v'shal machdusei, from the perspective of her neshama, from the perspective of this innate, deep, profound love which every Jew has to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Never does he ever want to separate himself from the oneness of Hashem. And to what degree would a person, a Jew, go not to separate himself from the oneness of Hashem? Like we said, afilu neitlimis nafsha mimena. Even they would take her soul away from her. Lavid aveda zara chas v'shalom. If she would be tested to serve idolatry, which means to prostrate herself to idolatry. And even idolatry is something so external. As Alter Rebbe explains in the end of chapter Yud Ches, and that he says that in the end, ultimately, you're dealing with a renouncement if they're demanded to say it verbally for a few seconds, or for a few seconds to prostrate in front of an idol. The Jew doesn't make the calculation, well, it's just an external act. I'll tell God 2 minutes later, or 2 seconds, even 2 seconds later, I'm with you, my heart is with you, my soul is with you. It's just a physical, external act, just to prostrate myself for even a few seconds. But we don't do that. The Jew, his allegiance with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so strong and so potent that he's ready, even when it comes to an external action or speech, which is external in comparison to what goes on in my heart. I just throw a word of heresy or prostrate myself for a few seconds. The Jew is ready to give up his life, even you're dealing with something so external. Why? Because his connection and his connection in his allegiance with HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so strong and so potent that even something external he's ready to give up his life for. He or she is ready to give up his life for. They're ready to give up their life for. Again, that's what he adds. Even if it's something so external, like prostrating oneself, in my heart, without any belief in this idol, yet I'm ready to give up my life, literally to expire, not to do something so external. And the famous story, the classic expression, or the classic demonstration of this illustration over here is the famous story of Hannah and her 7 sons. She had little children. And to the extent that when the king, which killed child by child because he didn't want to prostrate to that idol, he tried to do something because he saw he's not gaining any ground with these children, and he threw what he did with the younger one. He just threw his ring on the floor, and he said, "My little boy, just pick up the ring." And his mind, he wanted to demonstrate to the people around that eventually this boy will bow down to the idol, without knowing what he's doing. And right away the mother noticed that that's what the king had in mind, and she told her son, don't pick up the ring, because when you pick up the ring, you'll physically bow down to the idol. And guess what? The king took him away as well. And this is again one story, even though it has such this was Hannah and her 7 sons, and the Gemara says what happened with her after as well. She gave up her life, but this is the story of our history, unfortunately. Hundreds of thousands of Jews over the years gave up their life not to do something even externally. You're not talking with someone who goes and says, from now on I'm starting to believe in this idol. It's a Jew which, before that and after that, he would clearly align his heart with Hashem. And they only demanded of him, just do so, just bow down to this idol. We don't care what your heart says, what your heart feels, or what your heart believes. And yet the Jew is ready to give up his life, not to do even things so external. Because the ava, the love, what he has with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu is so profound and is so strong and is so well anchored in his system that even something external, even for a few seconds, again on the clock for a few seconds, even something external is ready to give up his life for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And now you're dealing with this taiva, with this temptation, which is as hard as it is. We know it could be yisurim, it could be painful to hold oneself back from a taiva, from a temptation. Particularly when it comes to the temptations associated with modesty. It could be very difficult. But it's much less than the difficulty of dying, let's put it clearly, as it is, And that's what Alter Rebbe says, V'kolshkin, how much more so lichbesh hayetzer, to conquer the Yetzer Hara, the taivas haniyuf, and the temptations, and the lusts of niyuf, again, of immodesty, which has, again, niyuf has a broad bracket, different levels of it. Generally, it's about immodesty. And shehem yisurim kalim. I agree that they're painful, but they're much lighter, mimisa Hashem yishmerenu. From the pain of death shall God forsake us and guard us. And yet, she's ready to do so. And that's why the pasuk says, Kisista ishta, it doesn't make sense. You yourself are ready to expire for God, and here you are allowing yourself to let loose, and again, conduct yourself in an immodest manner. So the whole the whole difference between her, and again, it's her. The Alter Rebbe speaks about her, the Seita, because that's where it says Kisista, but it's her, it's us. The whole difference, the way we would go ahead, chas v'shalom, to do, speak, or even think something which is inappropriate, the difference, back again, Shetzlah, but I just repeat, it's about her, it's about us. But Alter Rebbe is following the verse which deals about the Isha Saita, that woman which is a Saita, she went astray, and then Saita, she went off the derech of tznius, the path of modesty. The difference by her ben Isur Niyuf, the prohibition of immodesty, to the prohibition of prostrating oneself to an idol, is it's a spirit of foolishness which comes from the impure side. In other words, the impure forces have malbeshes nefshalikis, which encompasses, which encloses the godly soul. The godly soul wants to express its emes, and from the perspective of God, the godly soul, it knows that it's all the same. But here comes the cloud of the foolish spirit, and malbeshes, it encloses the godly soul, and it hides the purity of the godly soul, and not to the core essence of the godly soul, because the Alter Rebbe writes in the 24th chapter, the core essence of the godly soul never deviates or never separates itself from the oneness of Hashem. The core essence, as I said, till the Chokhmah, because in the Chokhmah of the soul, there's the Eir Hashem HaMulbish B'Chokhmah, is the godly light which is invested in the Chokhmah. In other words, there's a certain part of the Yid, like Yechida L'Yachtoch, there's different levels of the Neshama. There's the core essence of the Neshama is connected to the core essence of God. So when the foolish, the spirit, the cloud of the foolish spirit, which comes and wants to cover up on the purity of the neshama, it can cover up of every level of the soul, not the core essence. And that's what we find, the Alter Rebbe even points out when it comes to this very sin of idolatry. Even people who weren't particularly pious, religious, then you're talking about again in our history that hundreds of thousands which were not so aligned with the Shulchan Aruch the way it is, and they themselves gave up their life not to prostrate for a few seconds in the most external fashion to this idol. And Alter Rebbe explains because everything they did till then, which was also an expression of that cloud of the folly, the cloud of shtus, the cloud of foolishness, which covered up over their senses, over the neshama, and said, don't worry, do the other Avedas. When it came to this, they were challenged with clearly announcing or renouncing the oneness of Hashem. Then there's no way that they could translate the scenario differently. And that's when the core, the Chokhmah, we elaborated on this in chapter Yud Ches, and towards the end of Yud Ches as well, and in chapter Yud Tes, that there's the core essence of the neshama, that when it comes to a certain state of not to bow down, not to overtly violate and transgress the Aveda of Aveda Zarah, it's despite till then, and maybe even after then, they're not so strong with Torah mitzvahs yet. When it comes to that Aveda, when it's clear that my whole neshama is online, I'm ready to die for it. So he says over here that even this shtus, this cloud ultimately grabs the neshama, but not the core essence of the neshama. And Alter Rebbe says also, we mentioned just a moment ago about the 24, there's a few moments ago, the 24th chapter, that the core of the neshama, even when the person sins, it's always connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Even though the majority of it, the energy of it, falls into the sin as well, and it's impurified. And Alter Rebbe even says, because it's a godly reality, it's like taking God's face, the King of God, and the face of God rather, the face of the King, and putting it into a place of dirt and filth and decay and so on, because the neshama is a part of God, and when you sin, the neshama is coming with you. But even in that very chapter, the Alter Rebbe says the core essence of the neshama is Yechid L'Yachdav, is also connected to God. And this, in this case over here, what differentiates the differentiation between the prohibition of the immodesty, the prohibition of the bowing down to Avodah Zarah, is also that spirit of foolishness which wants to differentiate something which is the same. It's a foolishness to say when you take the poison you put in the applesauce, it's not going to kill. And when one is ready to convince himself, it's just because he got lost in something which is irrational. And this is the same thing. This is also because that's what it says. This is a ruach shtus, isha kisista. It's a ruach shtus which covers up the godly soul and the godly love and the innate, profound godly love which every Yid, including this woman, has to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Aval be'emes la'mitei, the Alter Rebbe continues. Afil aveiro kalo. That the truth of the matter, even the most lightest sin, when you violate, you're violating Hashem's Ratzain, and because you're violating, Hashem is standing there, and Hashem is saying, if it's about me, it's about following this rule of not doing this sin, irrelevant of the level of stringency of the sin itself. You're looking, we explained this again the other week as well, this Ratzin. When you look at the scenario and you stand in front of this temptation, may it be a Deiraisa, a Torah prohibition, or a rabbinic prohibition, or any, even a Kala, even a light rabbinic prohibition. If you look at it from the perspective of Ratzin, you look at the scenario, what does Hashem want me to do? It doesn't want me to do it. If He doesn't want me to do it, and then if I go ahead and I say, I'm doing it anyways, I'm with the ultimate separation of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's complete and total heresy. Hashem is saying no, and He's saying, not only He's saying no, the sin is the greatest antithesis of God. As we said, he said many times again, when Hashem says no, it's not like He said imini mani mo and He stopped by something. And when He says no, means to say that this whole action, this whole notion of this engaging in this sin or this action or in this speech or in this thought is the most distant area than one could ever get from the oneness of Hashem. And Hashem is standing there and saying no. And if I say yes, I remove myself. I am in the state of ultimate, in the worst and the most greatest and ultimate distance from the oneness of Hashem. And as we mentioned before, more than the spirit, more than the spirit of impurity, which is called the Lehimachayim, is called Avodah Zarah Mamash. The spirit of idolatry is less distant than HaKadosh Baruch Hu in comparison to my action, may it be an action or speech or even thought, when I violate the Ratzon Hashem. And therefore, and this is the truth, and if it's the truth, it's an equal killer, and therefore we have to understand that if the moment there's some spirit within us comes and tells us that bowing down to an idol, I understand that it's worth to give up your life, but any other sin, you're not really disconnecting yourself from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When a spirit comes to each one of us and tells this to us and tries to send this message, and unfortunately does so frequently send this message to us, we have to turn to ourselves and say, am I going to give in to this temptation and be a shaita? Which means to see that because it's covered with applesauce, it's not poison. It has a different image. I don't see the idol in front of me. Or I'm going to be a wise person and realize that in the end of the day, it's exactly the same as bowing down to the idol. It's exactly its expression and a demonstration and a manifestation of complete heresy in the oneness, complete denial in the oneness of Hashem. And if it's a complete denial in the oneness of Hashem, me as a healthy person, I will not allow that ruach, that spirit of impurity, to come and persuade me to do the opposite. Go ahead.
But because there's only these three things for which we are required to give up life. For the other things, if somebody says, be modest, or or like
any other sin,
eat non-kosher food.
Yeah.
I'm going to kill you. You're supposed to
right.
eat non-kosher food. So that means it must not be as severe consequences spiritually for yourself as the other things.
So we pointed out the other day, and Alter Rebbe says it over here. And interesting, he even brings a proof based on nigla, which means in halacha, he brings an interesting proof. We'll get there. We'll see the Alter Rebbe doesn't just say, it's just the gzeira, which means a decree of the pasuk. What do I say? Decree of the pasuk. We spoke about this, I think, last week or the other week, if you remember, that when it comes to, according to this, what the Alter Rebbe says over here, one would have to give up his life on every single sin. And even theoretically or conceptually, based on this explanation, even a rabbinic prohibition.
But
because it's all about heresy.
The halakha is not like that.
The halakha is not like that.
Why?
So the Alter Rebbe says, and he brings a proof, again, a proof from the halacha. We'll see it, a beautiful proof the Alter Rebbe brings from halacha. If I had any more time, I would say it over here, but we're going to get there. And he says the truth of the matter is, we needed to give up our life in every single aveira. And again, according to what he says, even a rabbinic sin. Because in the end of the day, it's complete heresy. And heresy, meaning to say, I'm bowing down to the idol by doing that sin. And for bowing down to the idol, I would give up my life. I should give up my life in every sin. So Alter Rebbe brings a proof. He says, essentially, conceptually, it should have been that way. And the only reason why Hashem said that the big three, in other words, the three famous Avedas, which is idolatry and also killing another person, or committing adultery, that's when a person has to give up his life. Why only by those three? The Alter Rebbe says it's exedas hakosov, it's something which we cannot make sense out of it. Because from our perspective, and the way the truth of the matter is, we should have given up our life for every sin. And the only reason why it's limited to those three sins is because God decided. What's the explanation? There is no explanation. So this reconciles. We say the truth of the matter is, we should have. The reason why we don't is because the same God which says not to.
Because the consequences must be so severe spiritually, but we don't make.
But we're not even talking about the consequence. We're not even talking about the consequence. Is every sin idolatry? Yes. If idolatry I have to give up my life, I should have given my life in this. The reason why not is because Hashem decided. There was a famous story, interesting story. It's not only so similar to this, but it just gives out the point. Because in the end of the day, it's all about what God said. Even over here, the fact that Hashem limited the big three, it's also about God. There's a story of Rabbi Elimelech and Reb Zusha with two brothers, the disciples of the Baal Shem Tov, of the Maggid, disciples of the Maggid. They were colleagues of the Alter Rebbe. And, one second, I'm getting a little bit... they were colleagues of the Alter Rebbe. They were the disciples of the Mezritcher Maggid. And they used to wander from town to town. It was part of their. They felt it was like an atonement, self-mortification, and so on. Again, there's a lot of history about two famous brothers, Reb Zusha and Reb Melech. They were two of great high stature in their service to God, and so on. Great chassidim. They were tzaddikim actually on their own. And the chassidim of the Maggid later, they were tzaddikim, each one on their own merit. So once they came to a place, and the people, and they were put into prison. The Jew was always, unfortunately, or many over the years, bitter years, they were hefker for whatever reason. They found something small to accuse them. They put him into prison. They wanted to daven. They wanted to put on tefillin. They wanted to daven, and the guards knew that halachically. They were very sad. They were very upset about it because they couldn't daven in that place, especially even today's, especially the prisons of the yesteryears. The basket of waste was in the same domain, and you're not allowed to daven there. And they felt terrible. And all of a sudden, one of the brothers told the brother, says, "Where does it say you're not allowed davening in a place where there's waste and so where the waste basket?" It says in Shulchan Aruch. And if it says in Shulchan Aruch, the reason why we cannot learn or pray, whatever they wanted to do, Dvarim Shebikdushin, was follow certain, do certain prayers or whatever Davar Kaddish, holy gestures which they wanted to do in that place. They said the whole reason why we can't do it is because the Shulchan Aruch says you can't do it. So all of a sudden they said, by us not doing it, we're also fulfilling the desire of Hashem. So they started dancing, and the guard comes in. They're dancing. I'm trying to. The guard knew that they can't do what they wanted to do. They can't serve God because of that. And then he didn't understand why they're dancing. So till they realized, they said they told or someone told the guard that they realized they're not doing their prayers in this place. It was also some type of service to the Creator, and they're excited of serving their Creator. And the guard said, "Oh, if that's the case, we're pulling them back to another room." And they pulled them back to another room, so they were able to daven and learn whatever they were going to do. What was the point? The point was that It's not. We could build up something which can make sense to us, but we have to always realize it's about God. It's not about us. And once really it's about God, it's a total different picture. Why am I saying this? The example which we're just saying over here is not exactly aligned with that or perfectly aligned with the story, but do understand that the fact that it's limited to these three, it's not because we can make sense of it. The only reason why Hashem says it's limited to these three, that these three have to give up your life, the rest of you don't, is because I decided that it's these three. But conceptually, if you think what the Aveda is, every Aveda is idolatry. And therefore we have to be careful when it comes to any scenario, maybe a Torah prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition, even Aveda Kala. With that violation, if I'm going to do something, when Hashem is standing there and He's telling this is no good, this is distant from me, and therefore you're completely ripping yourself away, complete heresy, complete denial of my reality, which normal Yid is going to go to Aveda? We understand that's heresy, and therefore we're not going to be this shaitan, we're not going to be this foolish person. We're going to stay composed and understand that if there's something Hashem says not to do, we will not do it. Have a great night.